The plenary speech will be conducted on the title Measuring Housing Well-being of Disaster-Affected Persons, Evidence from India, Japan, and Australia by Professor Piyush Tiwari, Professor in Property, Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, University of Melbourne, Australia. Professor Tiwari is the Professor of Property at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Prior to his current position, he was Director, Policy at Infrastructure Development Finance Committee, India, where he was responsible for formulating policies for private financing of urban infrastructure in close cooperation with national and state governments. He was also editor of India Infrastructure Report 2011 on water. Earlier, he was senior lecturer and program leader, MSc, at the Business School, University of Aberdeen, UK. He has held position at the largest mortgage company, HDFC India, and the University of Tsukuba, Japan. Professor Tiwari's research interests include infrastructure policy, housing economics and mortgages, commercial real estate investment, and financing infrastructure in developing countries. He has published numerous research papers on issues related to real estate and infrastructure, and has published a book titled International Real Estate Economics. He is a member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and his other professional activities include holding the position of Director of Asian Real Estate Society and Associate Editor in International Real Estate Review. So without any further ado, let me invite Professor Piyush Tiwari to deliver his speech. The session is over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Hasini, and thanks for a very kind introduction. And thanks also to the University of Sri Jayewardenepura, and it has been
Professor,
my privilege.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? Right. Are you able to hear me? Can you indicate if my voice is audible?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect.
All right. Okay. So I was saying that thanks to the university as well for having me today, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my slides. Right. So is that visible to everyone?
Yes, we can see, Professor.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do today is to briefly talk about measuring housing well-being of disaster-affected persons, evidence from India and Japan. In the title, Australia was also there, but given the time constraints, I will restrict myself to India and Japan. One of the key issues that we face, let me put this as a full screen first before I. Okay, so here we go. Now I think you should be able to see this better. So one of the key challenges that we face in determination of value in non-market transaction situation is that most of the time, those whose houses are being valued are dissatisfied. By non-market transaction situation, I mean for the compulsory acquisition purposes or after post-disaster determination of value for the compensation purposes. Now, this is not very uncommon that those whose properties are being acquired or those who have lost their properties and are being compensated for are unhappy with the compensation that is being offered to them. Probably what happens is that we have got the method of or the approach or the framework within which we determine value completely wrong. And that's where our research contributes to understanding what a housing means to a person whose property is being either acquired or lost during a disaster. We will look at a completely new approach to determine or to measure what a housing means to a household and what is the value that they assign to their homes. So that's with that context, I would be presenting our research on measuring housing well-being of disaster-affected person. The context is disaster affected person, but it is equally applicable to other non-market situations. The structure of my talk will be very briefly, I'll say what the aim is, then theoretical framework, which is the capability approach. The capability approach is an approach that Nobel laureate economist, philosopher Amartya Sen had proposed from the perspective of welfare or egalitarianism. And we will apply that approach in order to understand housing and the value that housing has for its owners. I will very briefly talk about disaster as a context for the discussion today, some select literature to illustrate the problem which the post-disaster reconstruction or compensation faces. Then the research questions, methodology, and some results from Japan and India, and also policy recommendation. I will very briefly mention what it means for the practice, such as valuers who are involved or engaged in determination of the value that needs to be compensated. The aim of today's discussion is to understand the role that housing plays in an individual and familial well-being. Now, well-being needs to be defined, and I will do so in my coming few slides. Let me start with a theoretical framework, which is a capability approach to well-being. Now, capability approach was proposed by Professor Amartya Sen way back in 1979, when he was talking about the challenges in determining egalitarianism or different measures of egalitarianism. He asked the question, as most egalitarians ask, that we should, in situations like this, where we have to compensate or where we have to address the question of welfare, it should make people equal. That's the theory of justice. But equality of what was the question that Amartya Sen asked. Now, the problem is that if we take the utilitarian approach, now utilitarian approach says that the utility of everyone should be maximized. But the trouble with utilitarian approach is that it is largely based on monetary measures, like, for example, income and so on, together with the marginal utility principle, which says that we should, the equality should be in terms of keep making the marginal utility of different individuals equal. Like, for example, if we are talking in terms of income, different people may have different marginal utility that derive from income. The person who is rich, the marginal utility of income would be lower compared to the person who is relatively less endowed with income. Their marginal utility will be higher. So they would value money much more compared to the person who is rich. So the equality would be in terms of making this marginal utility across different individuals equal. But the problem here is, again, it's a monetary. There are other aspects or other dimensions of equality as well, which the monetary value doesn't capture. To give you an example, now here is the GDP of different countries. Now, United States has the highest GDP. This is $1 trillion, billion dollars for 2021. And again, if we are looking at from the maximization point of view, the countries would try and maximize their GDP. But the problem with GDP maximization is that while it will ensure that the economic resources are utilized to the best, it will ensure that there is economic efficiency, but it will not guarantee equality of individuals within those societies. If we look at GDP per capita, again, here is a picture of different countries. These are top 50 countries in terms of GDP per capita in 2021 in US dollar terms. You can see that there is wide variation here. Luxembourg at one end, quite high compared to another. Here we are just looking at 50 countries, top 50. Barbados is on the other end, and the difference is quite large. The trouble again here is that, like, it doesn't ensure equality. Another measure of equality is Gini coefficient. Now, here is the Gini coefficient for different countries. What Gini coefficient says is that if it is 0, then it's more egalitarian or equal society. If it is close to one, it's unequal society. The inequality is at its maximum. So again, here are countries which are represented here. Now you can see that many of these countries lie between 0.20 to 0.45. And again, it means that there is some sort of inequality among countries or people who are living in those countries. The two purple line at the end are for India and China, which are also representing that the inequality in these countries is also quite serious. Sri Lanka also lies somewhere closer to the China Gini coefficient. The problem then is that most of the policies which are aiming to reduce income inequality will improve equality in one dimension, that is income and resources. But it will leave out a number of other dimensions, like, for example, educational equality or health equality, and some of those other dimensions which are also important for individuals' well-being or better living in life. Now, to give you an example, let's take this as one of the stories to understand what we mean by equality of what. So let's say that there are a family, let's say that a family has two boys. Now you would expect that these two boys, in terms of their personal attributes, personal characteristics, and the social view towards them, would be equal. So if we give both of these boys the same resources, would they achieve the similar kind of welfare or well-being in the future? Would they have the same kind of achievements in the future? Answer to that is no. The reason for that is because these two boys will have very different cognitive ability. Their capacity to reason, plan, solve problems, comprehend complex ideas would differ. Also, in terms of their physical strength and ability, they will also be different. So even though the resource endowment of both these boys are similar, but in terms of outcomes, they would be very different. So the personal characteristic will have an influence on how they can convert those resources into an achievement. So equal resources don't necessarily mean same achievement. Now let's take another example. Now let's say this family has a boy and a girl. Now we all know that given the patriarchal society in many countries, the preference is always tilted towards a boy. Now, again, the issue is that if these two children are given the same resources, would they have same achievement? Answer to that is no. The girl would far more be at a disadvantage compared to the boy. And this we see that in number of indicators, like wage inequality is one of those indicators where the two genders with roughly the similar kind of talent and qualification, the average income of women is lesser than a boy or a male. So again, the societal perception have a significant influence on how the resources would be converted into achievement. So equal resources, again, would not mean the same achievement. So what Amartya Sen and later on Nussbaum argues is capability is not just the ability residing inside a person, but also the freedom or opportunities created by a combination of personal ability and the social, political, and economic environment or the institutions. These determine how a person would use a resource in order to achieve the well-being that they are aspiring to. So the question of equality of what then basically means that equal ability of people to convert income and resources into personal achievement. And this depends on a variety of factors such as personal characteristic and institutional environment. Why I'm mentioning this, why this framework is necessary for us, that while housing is a resource, the ability or the benefits or the functioning that a person can derive from that housing would differ depending on their personal characteristic and the institutional environment. What that means is that the value of that house would differ from one person to another, depending on how they can use that house to achieve their functionings or capabilities. To give you an example from the housing, now housing as a resource helps people in creating many functioning. Let's take the first functioning. What is the first functioning? Being able to enjoy family life. The house is a place where people can come together, families can share their good moments and bad moments. And this is the main purpose of having a house where a family can live. Now, let's say that this gives some kind of happiness to the family. Now, another functioning could be that it gives financial security. If there's an extra room that a family can rent it out to somebody else, they can earn rental income. Now, if a house is lost, either due to a disaster or through compulsory acquisition, many of such functionings that are derived from housing are lost. The question then arises, if we are valuing house for its asset value, not for the functionings that it creates for a family or a household, then we are underestimating the utility or the benefit of that house to a family. So the aim of our research that we conducted over last few years is to identify the determinants of well-being that are derived from housing and measure the impact of these on housing satisfaction. These are the functionings which a household value, and that creates the value that a household generates from a house. Again, using Amartya Sen's framework, but contextualizing in the case of housing. Now, let's say an individual I has a housing entitlement. They have a house. Now, there is a conversion process which converts the housing entitlement into a vector of characteristics. These characteristics could be the number of rooms, the size, and other kind of characteristics in a Lancastrian framework that we are familiar with when we use the hedonic price type of model. Now, one thing which we have to understand here, that conversion process is exogenous to individual. So let's say that the housing entitlement is converted through some conversion process into a vector of characteristic. Now, how these vector of characteristics would be utilized depend on a personal utilization function of an individual. This personal utilization function is chosen out of feasible set of utilizations, which is a broader set from which a household, an individual would choose what the utilization function would be for these characteristics. Now, suppose there is a person who is disabled, who is unable to climb the stairs. So if there is a room on the upper floor of the house, it's of no use to them unless there are other kind of enablers within that house. So not all characteristics would be of use to everyone. So they have a personal utilization function that they apply to the vector of characteristic to determine what is the vector of achieved functioning. So these are the kind of achieved functionings that a household receives from that house. Now, this vector of achieved functioning is a subset of all the possible functionings from that particular house. Now, this broader set of functioning creates the capability, which is the well-being. This is an important concept here. Why is this important? Because the well-being or the capabilities that this house creates has the value. And that is what one assigns when one is looking at what they lose in the case of, say, compulsory acquisition of post-disaster reconstruction. So in the post-disaster reconstruction situation, what needs to be reconstructed is this capability or the functionings that a house can generate. I'll come to that, what we mean by these in a moment. But before that, let me give you the context of disasters, because during disaster, many things are lost, including housing, the livelihood, and so on. Here is the picture, which indicates that due to climate change and due to various other reasons, much of Asia has seen numerous disasters over the last 20 years. The nature of disasters differ, but they have one common characteristic, which is the loss of human life and loss of different kind of assets. If we look at the two biggest losses that households face, they are the damaged or destroyed dwellings and disrupted or destroyed livelihood. Asia has had its larger share of these destructions. Now, the question then arises is that if we were to reconstruct for the losses that households have suffered during disaster, what should be the best way? Now, the approach that has been taken by many of the multilateral institutions and the governments, they focus on housing and livelihood, both as a separate program. The problem, as identified by many of the researchers, is that the focus on housing reconstruction or provisioning in post-disaster recovery programs has mostly benefited middle-income households who were largely homeowners prior to disasters. But the challenge here is that renters also have a stake in their homes. They also derive capabilities or well-being that from a housing as a resource. But in post-disaster reconstruction, their losses remain uncompensated. Female-headed households without land rights, they have got excluded in many of the reconstruction programs. The post-disaster recovery approaches recovery as a sectoral approach, which means housing and livelihood as two sectors. But livelihood is also linked to location. Housing is also linked to location. So the locale becomes quite an important, we cannot dissociate from either of these two. And hence it becomes important that this is viewed more as a unified rather than a separate program. We also looked at another dimension of post-disaster reconstruction, which is relocation. Many of the households in Chennai, after flooding, they were relocated to another location. The household who were relocated were living along the rivers in informal settlements, while the relocation or relocated colonies gave them the property rights and better housing, but households were dissatisfied because the location could not be compensated for. So the question then arises, what are those determinants of housing well-being? How personal characteristics of individual impact their housing well-being? What is the influence of disaster vulnerability on housing well-being? How does relocation impact on housing well-being? And what policies emerge to guide satisfactory post-disaster reconstruction of losses of affected person? Is it the compensation for asset loss or income? Or is it more than that we need to look at when we are designing the reconstruction and compensation programs? Now, the first thing, let's look very briefly into what are the functionings that a house generates. Now, these functionings are based on some of the research that we have done in the past. What are the fundamental functionings that land generates? Now, the first one is the power to take decision on land and housing matter. If somebody owns a house or land, they are able to make physical improvement. They're able to repair or remodel. They're able to seismic retrofit. So all these are important because they can take decisions with regard to their homes. And that is an important functioning because it gives them control over their physical environment. The second important functioning is the personal comfort and convenience, like the size of the house, the age of the house, if there's a garden where the family can see children play, if they are able to see that the value of the house is appreciating, or they can rent the house, where it is located. All these are important factors to live comfortably and conveniently in a home. And that contributes to the functioning of personal comfort and convenience. Then the third important functioning that a house generates is a familial well-being, being able to live with family, being able to contribute towards each other. There's a generational contract there in the sense that there is inheritance possibility, which means that one is taking care of the welfare of children in the future. There is also some dysfunctioning. If the house is small and household size is bigger, this could cause congestion. So there are some dysfunctioning associated with the size of house and so on. But what it says is that the house also contributes to the familial well-being. There's also secure means to basic end. Being able to improve the house, being able to retain its value, the building type, and so on, they all contribute to be prepared for disaster and being resilient, can protect oneself against disaster. Then there are other functionings as well, like, for example, financial security. House is a store of value. The value of house, the city size, where it is located, they all contribute to the value of house. But it could also cause financial stress, that is a negative functioning. If there's a concern with regard to job, or it's concerned with regard to the age, which means that the person is not able to earn adequately to pay the mortgage and other things that could cause financial stress. The house is a place of self-identity. Self-identity relates to the memories of the family. Or if it's an inherited property, then it has a family memory of many generations. It's also a place which can give identity and status to the family. If one owns a house, they associate their family identity and status with that. It also gives social equity, particularly if a woman is owning a house, it gives them empowerment. Then there are psychological well-being associated with house. If the house has been affected by earthquake, inundation, and so on, since we are looking at disaster as the context, it could have a negative connotation there. It also gives a social capital, the neighborhood, the location, the length of stay, all contribute to the social capital through locational stability. And then the length of stay in a current house also gives the political empowerment, because one can vote, one can decide on the political governance in that area. Now, if we are looking at the household contributes to all these different functionings, when we are valuing from the market value perspective, are we valuing from this perspective? Are we valuing what it means to a household? That becomes a question. So let me give you some of the results that we have for Japan. I won't go into great details here, but will illustrate some of the key points that emerge. So Japan, we had a fantastic data on the country level, and we were concerned with the Fukushima triple disaster that included the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster that happened in 2011 in Tohoku. And what we were looking at, how people value the functionings that their houses created, because many of the houses were destroyed and many of the people had to move. So the methodology that we are using here is, since we have a panel data, we observe the housing well-being of these households over a period of time. We conducted econometric models, the OLS as well as fixed effect panel data modeling. As you can see here, our dependent variable was housing satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being least satisfied with their house and 10 being the most satisfied. And there were a number of indicators of functionings. What are these functionings? Essentially, the characteristics of house, as we discussed earlier, that contribute to housing satisfaction. But these on their own do not create the functioning. So we need some person-centric variables. These are the abilities of a person to convert those characteristics into a functioning, as well as the institutional factors like the social and political and economic variables that also contribute to conversion of characteristics into functioning. Then we also do a fixed effect model, which looks at how the satisfaction of with regard to housing has changed over a period of time for a particular household. Now, I'm not going to show you those tables of results because they probably has less relevance here. But what is important here is the kind of results that we get. Now, again, remember the kind of functionings that we were talking about were, let's say the first functioning was power to take decision on land and housing matters. So in our results, we find that the implementation of remodeling or seismic retrofitting increases satisfaction with housing among owner-occupied households. So what it is saying is, if a house is owner-occupied, and if a household can remodel or seismic retrofit, which can protect them from future disasters, they are more satisfied. Why? Because it gives them the power to take decisions on land and housing matters. Income has a positive effect on satisfaction because if a household has a larger income, they are able to change or retrofit or modify their houses to their requirements. Again, it's the power to take decision on land and housing matters. The second important functioning was the personal comfort and convenience of family well-being. Now, what we found here is that a person who is living alone is relatively less satisfied with their housing. And there is also a difference between owners and renters. And this effect is far more pronounced for renters than owners. Compared to the households who do not work, the satisfaction level of working household is lower because they are not able to spend that much time in their house. So their satisfaction is lower. So the congestion, lack of privacy is another negative externality of living with parents and children that negatively impacts housing satisfaction. Now, what it says is that there are these factors which are person-related, person-oriented factors, which also have an impact on the functionings that a housing generates. The third important functioning was secure means to basic end. That house is a secure means to basic end. So households who do not have earthquake insurance, but intend to have one, are relatively less satisfied with their housing because they feel that they want earthquake insurance, but they don't have it. So they are less satisfied with their housing. Housing satisfaction of respondents who neither have insurance nor intend to take is not affected by their insurance status. So the answer to this is that the earthquake insurance plays a crucial role in household satisfaction with their housing. Financial security, again, the positive coefficient with inheritance, which means that if the households are able to get a house as inheritance, which gives them financial security, they are far more satisfied. Self-identity is another variable. Positive relationship between housing satisfaction and length of stay. If they have stayed longer, which means that they associate self-identity with that location and housing, they are much more satisfied. Social equity, the female household associate higher housing satisfaction compared to male because it gives them the social equity or social empowerment, which again comes with the housing. Psychological well-being, households who have experienced damage by the Great Japan earthquake and are in areas with high inundation, they report a lower satisfaction with their house. So the sense of unsafety or vulnerability again has a negative connotation with the housing satisfaction. Now, one of the problems is that when we are looking at from the functioning point of view, the conventional approach becomes a little challenging when we are valuing house for an individual. In a post-disaster compensation situation where a house had to be compensated, it would be worthwhile seeing how best can we recreate some of these functionings which are lost. There are a number of policy recommendations that emerge. One is that the quick recovery of home ownership and stable income are important for well-being and post-disaster recovery. The seismic retrofitting and earthquake insurance is crucial to individuals' disaster resilience. Earthquake insurance is a major policy issue. Given the special role of home ownership, particularly from the women's perspective, this becomes an important area of intervention. Reducing the sense of unsafety or vulnerability through retrofitting or through insurance improves the psychological well-being of residents. So what it means is that if we look at some of these recommendations, that the mere compensation of the value of asset value of a house or reconstruction of a house in another location is not sufficient. What is required is that a range of functioning would need to be recreated for the satisfaction of households post-disaster. And that's where the equality of what comes in picture. Is the equality, which the question which Amartya Sen was asking, is the equality of these functionings across different households that become important. The same story goes in for India. Now in India, this is the map of Chennai. The two blue lines here, two blue curves here, are the two rivers. And the red connecting line between the two rivers is the canal. A lot of informal settlement is located along these riverbeds and the canal. But what has happened over a period of time since 2004 onwards, numerous floods have affected households who have been living in these informal settlements. That's one cause of destruction to the housing and the neighborhood that households have suffered. The other one is the developmental plans. I don't know whether you can see this cursor. The line here is the metro line that was constructed. And this also caused a lot of displacement, a lot of acquisition of properties compulsorily, which also impacted households. So what we did a survey of households who were resettled into another location, whose properties were either acquired or were affected by disaster, but they were resettled in purpose-built colonies in 3 locations, which are mentioned here. Now, we conducted a survey to ask their satisfaction with their housing. We then estimated, given that it was a quantitative data that we collected, we used a multinomial logic model in order to determine what the determinants of housing satisfactions are, again, from the perspective of the functionings and the indicators of functionings. The housing satisfaction that we measured was on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very dissatisfied to 5 being very satisfied. Now, again, without going into the details of those results, what it comes out is what people value, really not the bricks and mortars, but the functionings that their houses create. The opportunity for higher household income was not equally distributed in those resettlement colonies. Some households were able to leverage their homes and location and find employment which were either similar to where they were before being relocated or better than those, but for others, they were not. Many of the families which had 2 persons working households, 1 person could not find employment, while other probably continued in lesser or similar kind of employment. So the opportunities were not equally distributed, and they're very location specific. The importance of neighborhood security and social capital is also underscored in this research. In the previous location, the household knew everybody in their neighborhood. But in the resettlement colonies, since the households were relocated from numerous places, the security and social capital was a concern. The safety level and neighborhood and access to an informal social system for childcare are important. In India, the challenge of formal social system is there. When the parents go for work, there are no formal systems to take care of children who are left behind home. So what it meant was that if a family had younger children, this reduced their employment opportunities because one person had to stay at home in order to take care of children. So safety and security was a concern. Again, it's related to the neighborhood. The relocation weakened the social and economic association, which negatively impacted the housing well-being or housing satisfaction. Many of the houses were multi-storied units, which was culturally inappropriate for the fishing communities that were relocated to these colonies. And that again caused, even though there were formal property rights, brick and mortar construction or the durable construction compared to where they were living before, but they were not satisfied. Flooding and consequential fear of losing assets still persist. Satisfactory level of protection from disaster is another issue. Social equity and empowerment of female was a concern because most of the houses that were allocated in the male member's name. So this had less involvement of female. Even in the design, the female were not involved. So that again causes a problem and their satisfaction with the housing. Safety and well-being of children and women, that needs to be addressed because these were concerned within the neighborhood. So again, the question that arises that when we are valuing the compensation or when we are determining the compensation, the asset value is not sufficient. A number of policy recommendations that emerge. There is always a priority towards in situ development, and that should be retained in any post-disaster compensation and reconstruction processes. Carefully crafted insurance policy for income and property would ensure that households do not lose the value of their assets. Insurance policy for loss of life can speed up recovery process because the satisfaction with housing also means that there has to be satisfaction with income, and loss of life means loss of income as well. So insurance policies would need to be. The direct cash transfer during the period when households have little bit of fluctuation in their income would also have. Guaranteeing income security, such as would require restitution of jobs and employment, that would also be important. So again, emphasizing the point that in any post-disaster compensation, the value of house has to go beyond the market value. The location and its connectivity to the rest of the city is important. The house should meet the cultural and social expectation. The people should be involved in their planning and development. Non-design steps are also important here. The social capital is an important contributor to housing well-being for vulnerable communities, and social and economic infrastructure must precede the resettlement. So the question, let's revisit our research question. So what is important for us is to understand that the determinants of housing well-being that create value are much more than the asset value. And that's what these research indicate to us. These are the ability of a household to convert the characteristic of house into functionings that they value. The impact of personal characteristic of individual on housing well-being is paramount, because the ability of each individual to convert the housing characteristic into functioning differs. The influence of disaster vulnerability on housing well-being could be significant. And when we are looking at from the perspective of reconstruction, it would be important that these functionings are reconstructed. The impact of relocation of housing well-being is usually negative. Households are never satisfied. So as far as possible, these should be avoided, because housing is not just brick and mortar that the people value, but it's also the neighborhood which brings the social capital and social equity. The policy to guide satisfactory post-disaster reconstruction must include the reconstruction of the lost functioning. What is the relevance to practice? Why are we discussing this? The relevance to practice is that many of us as valuers would be involved at some point in time in determining the value that needs to be compensated, either during the situation where the property is being compulsorily acquired or in a post-disaster situation. Now, it's important for us to understand that the value of a house is not just the asset value in a market value situation. It's much more than that. That's why a particular house is not in the market. And determining that, we would need a fresh approach, which is a way to do that would be to use a framework that Amartya Sen proposes, which is a capability approach, in order to understand what a house means to an individual and what kind of functionings that it creates that the households value. And these are the functionings which have a value, that sum total of which associate with the value of a house. I'll stop here and would welcome any questions if there are.